Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're keeping lovely and warm, and go and get yourself that lovely hot cup of cocoa, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Grayson, although people often call me Gray for short, and I'm from North Carolina, which is situated in the southeastern part of the United States, with Charlotte as our main city. North Carolina is without question an exquisite part of the world, with beautiful vistas, scenic imposing mountains, dreamy forests, awe-inspiring sunsets, and shorelines that stretch for miles, and so much more. I grew up in a rural area here with my two older sisters, Bonnie and Tabitha. I was raised in the 80s on a small sweet potato farm by both my parents. We lived in a rather enchanting old shabby farmhouse, but although charming, it wasn't in the best condition. It was in desperate need of a loving makeover and renovation. But my parents kept stalling any building projects. They simply hated the idea of all the appalling upheaval and chaos that a building project would obviously ensue, not to mention the steep crippling costs of renovation that they would sooner rather avoid. We were not wealthy by any manner of means, and money was always rather tight, as our sweet potatoes were not a vast sizable enough crop to procure a large enough profit for all of our needs. Yet we could not complain about anything, because life was rarely kind to us. We lived in an exquisite rural location, surrounded by gravel roads, ubiquitous areas of natural forest, creeks, ponds, silvery streams, verdant valleys and prairies, and for a young boy, the natural world was my quintessential playground, as we would go hiking, camping, mountain biking, exploring, fishing and engaging in all manner of outdoor pursuits, which invariably is what my family did over the years. One day my father randomly announced that my Uncle Teddy was coming to stay with us, and the news seemed incredibly exciting to the all of us, as we had never met our uncle before. He lived in a quaint village in Derbyshire in England. He was initially from the States like my father, but had fallen in love with an English girl at university, and they had subsequently married, and never had any children of their own. "Now I want you to be very nice to your Uncle Teddy when he arrives," my father announced. "He's going through a very hard time at the moment and needs all the emotional support he can get. Do you understand? No games, no tricks, no funny business with him." We all nodded our heads in unison, not really comprehending what on earth my father was going on about. I was to learn from eavesdropping in on my parents' conversation that Uncle Teddy was going through a tumultuous, turbulent divorce. "I never did like that pompous English girl," I heard my mother say. "There was something about her that rubbed me up the wrong way. But to cheat on Ted like that, it's quite horrifying, and with a woman of all things, that's got to be the worst thing of all. I mean, it doesn't get more humiliating than that." "Well, I think it's been over for a very long time," my father reflected. "I think the cheating was the final nail in the coffin, and was the catalyst that brought the relationship to a head. I think he'll be glad it's all finally over. He needs to move forward now and leave the past behind him. Onwards and upwards, as they say." "I'm sure you're right," said my mother. "But even so, relationships are not easy to get over, are they? I don't know what I'd do if you cheated on me. It would tear me apart." "Lucky you won't have to find out, dear," said my father, kissing my mother tenderly on the cheeks. "That's never going to happen, because I love the bones off you, my sweetheart." I must admit, when my Uncle Ted arrived at our home, even though I'd never actually met him before, he did look rather battle-weary, rather like a traumatised soldier returning from an arduous stint of duty in Vietnam, who had seen way too much and was overwhelmed by the issues of life. I could tell my languished uncle was so sad and heartbroken. He was pleased to see us, though, and remembered us when we were little. He brought us handbags all the way from Carnaby Street, made from potato sack fabric, along with T-shirts and the most fantastic posters of London punks that we just loved. My uncle's appearance was somewhat dishevelled, and he appeared rather thin and emaciated, as if he hadn't eaten for a long while. He did have a propensity to drink a little too much, which was worrisome for my father, who claimed that before my uncle moved to England, he had barely touched the stuff at all. "What has that dreadful woman done to my poor brother?" he confided to my mother. "I mean, the poor man is broken. He's a shadow of his former self. He's refusing to talk about the divorce. I can tell he's very aggrieved and distressed, the way he's tucking into that drink, as if it's cranberry juice. It bothers me greatly, it really does." "Well, drink is never the answer to your problems," reflected my mother. "It's emotionally healing to talk about your troubles. I also think a little light exercise would do him the world of good." My parents began to actively encourage my uncle to take regular walks around our property, and of course the surrounding rather remote rural area, which was indeed breathtakingly beautiful. "There's nothing more healing than a brisk walk in the countryside," my mother had assured him. "It will help you heal, Teddy, like nothing else I know. Nature is the best medicine for the soul." Before long, Teddy began to take my mother's advice, and he took regular walks in the countryside. Sometimes he was gone for hours on end, and every day he looked a little brighter, and the colour was coming back into his sunken cheeks. He would talk about the indigenous wildlife he encountered, and would enthuse about the ravishing countryside. We all could discern a remarkable change in his countenance. Once again he had resumed his shaving rituals, which had to be a good thing, and the ugly beard that covered his boyish face had disappeared. He was one of those men who just simply did not look good sporting a beard. Another promising sign was that he appeared to be paying much more attention to his appearance, and even my mother had noted a spring to his step. "You forget how big things are in America," he explained to her. "I just cannot get over the space here, and the areas of woodland are quite breathtaking. I think you're right, Tracy," he said, referring to my mother. "I'm already beginning to feel like a brand new man. I'm energized and more positive about my life." "Didn't I tell you?" laughed my mother. One day my uncle came bolting through the kitchen. He was hyperventilating and breathing heavily, and he grabbed a large bottle of brandy and began to glug it down his throat like lemonade. I remember his eyes were so wide and his mouth was hanging open. It was clear that he was deeply distressed, unsettled and discomposed by something. My mother tried to calm him down, but he was shaking like a leaf and seemed incredibly rattled. "Has something happened?" asked my mother. "You look as white as a sheet. Have you had a scare of some kind?" "I've seen a black monster in the woods, an ape-man. It attacked and killed a poacher, and I saw it with my eyes." My uncle began to sob uncontrollably. "I thought it was going to kill me. It was big and hairy." My mother and father looked at each other, and it was clear that they did not entirely believe my uncle's account, and thought that all his emotional anxiety and upheaval around the divorce was making him hypersensitive. "Maybe you witnessed a bear attack," said my father. "I'll call the authorities immediately to let them know that someone's been mauled by a black bear. Unfortunately, this kind of thing does happen, and it's very frightening to observe. Thankfully, the creature didn't harm you, so we can be grateful for small mercies." The authorities were called, and the body was recovered, and it was all just put down to a bear attack. Years later, my uncle told me the true story about what had transpired that day, once I realised that he had indeed seen an ape-like humanoid, a creature that we like to call Bigfoot. So this was his account in his own words. I was beginning to feel so much brighter, happier and more positive about my life, as moving in with my brother and his family into his delightful North Carolina farmhouse was quintessential the wisest decision I've ever made, as it helped me get back on my feet again and rebuild my shattered and broken life. I'm not going to kid you, there were harrowing, grievous moments when I simply wanted to just swallow a whole bunch of pills and be done with it all. At that point in time, I began to feel helplessly lost and despairing, as if the world was closing in on me and had become a dark, oppressive place of which there was no light at the end of the tunnel, nor was there any hope on the horizon for me. For me personally, getting a divorce was one of the hardest blows of my entire life, and despite everything, I still loved my ex-wife. Losing her was as bad as experiencing a death in the family. Granted, our relationship had been tumultuous at the best of times, and we had fought a great deal, over the silliest, most pathetic things, I might add. Yet, despite all the hiccups along the way, I still believed our relationship was worth saving. When my wife began having an affair with another woman, it was the cruelest, most underhanded blow of all, as I knew that I could never ever compete. When my wife informed me that she had secretly hankered after other women all her life, ascertaining that she had been a closet lesbian all along, I must confess that was paradoxical and incomprehensible for me to fathom. I had never guessed, even for a single moment, that she actually had leanings towards the other side. Finally, we both agreed that getting divorced was the only solution, especially considering my wife confessed that she had fallen head over heels in love with another woman. This woman looked like the female version of Arnold Schwarzenegger, without being unkind. She had a shaven head, tattoos and biceps on her arm that would make mine look puny by contrast. It was then that I decided that I needed to get out of England and return to America, as that would create a larger enough distance between the two of us to begin our new lives. I couldn't face the prospect of bumping into my wife arm in arm in the street with another woman, who looked like she'd stepped out of a female prison and beaten up all the inmates. I'm not exaggerating, as that was how rough her new partner actually looked, which made me wonder why she'd ever found me attractive. I've always been incredibly close to my brother, and so staying with him on his farm was a tremendous blessing for me. I really don't think I would have held it together without the support of his loving family. Tracy, his wife, was right that venturing out into the wide open spaces was healing for me, until one day everything changed. After eating a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs, washed down with some hot mugs of tea, I decided to set out for another brisk walk, armed with my pair of binoculars and a bottle of drinking water. I remember it was a blissfully pleasant day, with some warm sunshine and a gentle breeze blowing against my face. I trekked along several windy dirt roads, kicking up some of the pebbles with my boots. Finally, I was turning into my favourite area of wood green. It was magical, like a fairy tale-like setting, enabling me to leave behind negative, irksome thoughts from my past and focus on the present and the future. In truth, I had no comprehension whatsoever that a wooded area like this could be so bedazzling, tranquil and calming. It was like the quintessential resplendent oasis of natural beauty, consisting of mature, very regal, statuesque-looking spruce, pine, cedar, oak and redwood trees, all with the most marvellous, shapely, sometimes even voluptuous trunks that rose up into the heavens like towering skyscrapers of nature. If that wasn't mesmerising enough, the shafts of sunlight that twinkled through the trees and dappled the forest floor in different shades of luminescent light were almost ethereal in their subtlety and soft radiance. I noticed that layers of velvety moss swathed the tree trunks and boulders with a rich, luxurious, verdant carpet, and shapely golden-brown umbrella funguses attached themselves to the lower trunks of the trees, while the forest floor was layered with sweet woodruff, large open lacy ferns, and interesting flowering ground covers. Most beguiling of all, however, was the stream that zigzagged through the woods with an energising swift current, and the sound of the water crashing against the rocks was so soothing to my troubled soul. On most occasions, as I'd ambled through the sublime wooded retreat, I'd been serenaded by the sounds of pretty birdsong, or I would catch a brief sighting of a few startled deer darting out of my sight as quickly as they could, or a squirrel eyeing me curiously with its brown, bright, sparkling eyes. On this occasion, everything was airily quiet, so much so, in fact, that I could feel chills going down my spine, and my hair was standing on edge. I really got the sense that I wasn't alone, and I could feel that I was being watched, but I looked around and saw absolutely nothing. I also detected a rather strange smell in the air, which wasn't something I was well acquainted with. It did smell rather sweaty and skunky. That was when I heard a man's voice, or men's voices, should I say, laughing, and I could hear their rifles firing at random, sounding like kids playing with BB guns. I realised that someone was hunting illegally, as there had been warning signs saying hunting prohibited everywhere. I realised that these were poachers, and I didn't want to stick around to get accidentally shot. Before I had a chance to make my hurried escape, a rough-looking thuggish man emerged through the thicket and walked directly towards me. He stopped dead in his tracks for a moment. I knew I'd caught him off guard, and he hadn't expected to see me. I noted a deep scowl developing on his face, and his cold, hard brown eyes glared at me very coldly. "Who are you?" he asked defensively. "I'm just taking a walk in the wood green, but I'm leaving now," I assured him. The insidious, shady-looking character immediately made me feel ill at ease and unsettled. I was greatly disturbed when he kept pointing his rifle in my direction, almost like he was guilefully trying to warn me off. "Good idea," scoffed the man. "You wouldn't want to end up accidentally shot, would you? Or easy meal for the coyotes?" He began to laugh, as if he seemed to find his sense of humour highly amusing, but I most certainly did not. I sensed an underlying undercurrent of artful threat to his words. If you had told me he'd buried a body in the woods, I would have believed you. There was something very devious and shifty about him that made my skin crawl. "Who is this?" came the husky deep voice of another man who emerged through the thicket, regarding me with very suspicious hard eyes that were seemingly devoid of any kindness. He was even more intimidating and thuggish than the first man that I had encountered, as he was looking like a menacious gangster, covered in inky blue tattoos of giant octopuses and dragons, and on his bald head there was a skull and crossbones, making him appear much more than a little menacing and pugnacious. And if that wasn't enough, his rifle was almost pointed directly in my face, causing me to tremble. Were they intent on killing me, I wondered in horror. I wouldn't have put anything past them. "What are you doing here?" he demanded in a threatening tone. "I'm just taking a walk," I said. "Well, you need to get out of here," said the man. "We're hunting, and you need to watch your back. And if you dare tell anyone that you saw us here, you'll be sorry. Do you understand?" He said this while reenacting a chicken having its head ripped off with his hands. I knew exactly what he was saying. "I've got enough problems of my own to contend with," I said. "It's none of my business what you get up to in here." "Don't be hard on him," said a small man emerging through the brush in a plaid shirt and jeans. "I'm sure he's telling you the truth. Don't hurt him. Leave him alone. If you hurt him like you did the other man, I shan't be keeping my mouth shut. Not this time." "Shut up, Johnny. The day I need your advice, I'll ask you for it. The man's going. He's not going to give us any trouble, are you?" "No," I said. "No, I'm not." Johnny suddenly became very distracted. "I think we should call it a day," he said, looking alarmed. "Something's not right about the woods today. I feel it in my gut." "Johnny, for goodness sake, get a grip," said the man with the bald head. "We're here to hunt. Stop being such a mama's boy." "I'm not," Johnny protested. "Something is watching us. I can feel it, and it's creeping me out." All of a sudden we heard a loud growl. It was so discomposing that all four of us just stood, very still, hardly daring to move a muscle. The only way I can describe the sound to you was that it was deeper and more menacing than that of a lion. "What the heck?" said the bald man. "What was that?" Then I noted that the saplings began to sway backwards and forwards, and I could see the silhouette or dark outline of a large form. And then it peered in at us through the branches, pulling them away like a curtain, from 8 feet off the ground. And it possessed a dome-shaped head, and I can only describe that it looked like a humanoid ape. I was so startled and spooked by what I was seeing that I began to question my own sanity, for indeed I'd never seen a critter looking like this before. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my entire life, and even a lion seemed like a pussycat compared to this monstrous, colossal, and very intimidating beast. I remember feeling my stomach twisting into hundreds of knots, and my heart fluttering so fast, so much so that I could hear every single beat reverberating in my chest really loudly. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that we were in the presence of an apex predator. Kill him! Kill him!" shouted the man with the bald head. "Kill him now!" 2 of the men began to shoot at the critter, but Johnny just stood there, frozen to the spot, seemingly unable to move a muscle. I realised that, just like myself, he was also incapacitated by fear and overwhelmed by the horror of this surreal situation. The indignant, livid critter came charging through the brush like a rampaging elephant. He was incandescent with rage. He thundered aggressively towards the bald man, grabbing him violently by the shoulders and tearing the rifle out of the man's hand. I watched in absolute horror as he snapped this man's rifle in half, as if it was just a kid's toy, and threw it into the brush. I will never forget the absolute dread and sheer horror in the bald man's blue eyes. He'd been so cocky when he had approached me with such an aggressive manner, but he now looked like a petrified little boy, as his eyes grew round with alarm. I watched in amazement as he began to sprint away, all the while screaming, "No! No! No! Please, no!" In his attempts to run, he tripped a couple of times, but he was no match for this critter. Never in all my born days have I ever seen anything move as fast as this critter did. In a second he grabbed the bald man. He lifted him up by the scruff of his collar until he was staring directly into the man's eyes, with a very mean look on his face. For a moment the eyes of the bald man locked into the eyes of this beast. The critter then rolled back his lips, exposing his human-like teeth, and began to growl again incredibly fiercely. And I promise you that even the ground vibrated as he growled. All of a sudden, he tossed the man about 20 feet up into the air, where he came crashing down, landing on his head, which burst open like a chicken egg, and all the brain matter came oozing out onto the ground. I noted that the man who had initially approached me in the wood green had surreptitiously made his escape, leaving the two of us stranded, yards away from this ferocious, capricious and volatile predator. I was absolutely certain I was already dead, and I began to pray desperately as I saw my life flashing before my very eyes. Once the critter had killed the man, he went over to the dead body and kicked it several more times, and then he seemed to calm down. "Please don't hurt us," I cried out. "We weren't the ones shooting at you. We weren't going to hurt you." Johnny followed my lead. "No, we weren't going to hurt you. Please, please don't kill us," he begged. Whether the critter understood us or not, I have no idea, but there was a very evident humanness to his countenance that we appealed to. He stood still for a moment, studying us curiously through his deep-set dark eyes that seemed to no longer appear enraged. For a moment it was like he was looking straight through us, as if he could read our very thoughts. The critter suddenly seemed to become very relaxed and calm. It was like his aggression fully subsided. We were observing a completely different animal. To my amazement, he began to scratch and itch his back, and then in a nonchalant way he just strolled back into the wood green and glided away. Johnny and I remained frozen to the spot and did not move from our position for a long while. Even though I didn't know Johnny personally, we locked into a warm embrace as we realised we were so lucky to be alive, and that the critter had no intention of harming us. We couldn't believe it. Johnny looked at me and exclaimed, "I cannot believe Dirk is dead, but he had it coming to him. I mean, anyone could see you don't shoot at something like that. He was asking for trouble. He always is. I warned them that the woods didn't feel right today, but they wouldn't listen." He then turned around to me and said, "Do you mind telling the police that you saw a dead man in the woods? I don't want to get involved with any of this, as I've already been arrested for poaching before. I don't need any more trouble on my back." I nodded and then walked away, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. I knew the only reason Johnny and I had escaped with our lives is that we hadn't actually challenged the critter with a rifle. It would seem that the critter had not suffered any wounds from the barrage of bullets he had faced, which in itself was incredulous. I walked back to my brother's farmhouse, pondering on what it was I had seen. The critter must have been about 8 foot tall, 4 feet across on the shoulder area. He had short, stocky legs and very long arms, and was built as solidly as an army tank, and easily weighed about 800 pounds. I noted he was covered in long human-like hair that was dark brown in colour, but with a very distinct auburn hue in certain lights. The face was human-like, with a nut-brown skin that was the texture of leather. I noted that the critter had a head shaped rather like a dome that seamlessly folded into his shoulders, with no apparent neck to speak of. What I remember was those eyes, and how they changed from hateful to gentle in just such a short period of time. When I returned to my brother's farmhouse, it was like the post-traumatic stress of the event reoccurred and replayed in my mind. I began to have the most horrifying flashbacks of the bald man's death. Even though he was an awful man, I wouldn't have wished his death on anyone. When I told my brother and his wife what I'd actually seen, I knew that they thought I'd seen a bear. But I know what I saw, and this was no bear. But I also perceived that unless they'd actually seen it themselves, how could they ever believe my story? I certainly wouldn't in their shoes. So there you are. That was my uncle's story, which even as a young boy, I failed to believe at the time. Yet it's amazing how things change, because in the twinkling of an eye, when I was walking through the wood green myself one day, I had an encounter with the beast that my uncle had described so eloquently. Possibly not the same one, but a critter fitting a similar description. Nevertheless, I'm very glad to inform you that the critter I encountered was benign. It was more afraid of me than I was of it. I encountered it quite by chance. It was eating the grubs from the inside of a tree branch, and it suddenly looked up and on seeing me glided away so fast, taking 5-foot strides and vanishing from my sight. For days afterwards, I kept asking myself, did I really see that? Surely not. But I knew what I saw. I'm glad to tell you that my uncle did actually remarry and is now happily living relatively close to us in North Carolina, and I used to visit him regularly over the years, and we became incredibly close. All these years later, after the coverage on the Sasquatch, we knew what we saw were clearly Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story, and my uncle's as well. Wow! What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.